Hello, and welcome back to the 8th live stream of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. We have named this one Behind the Eighth Ball, and the reason is because it's a what we call in English a idiom. And there are a lot of, every language has a lot of idiomatic phrases. One of my favorite is the idiomatic phrase in Hebrew for 40, meaning an indefinite period of time. Now, what makes an idiomatic phrase distinct is you cannot understand what it means just from its grammatical portions. Like behind the eight ball, you got a preposition, you've got a definite article, and you've got a noun. And none of it actually makes sense unless you understand the cultural reference of the game of pool. So it's an idiomatic expression, and I love idiomatic expressions. They're very, very interesting, and the Bible is full of these. I think one of the most interesting idiomatic expressions actually occurs in Genesis between Jacob and Laban. Now, after Jacob makes off with both Leah and Rachel, Laban follows him. And basically, Laban says to Jacob, "May the Lord be between you and me whenever we're apart." Now, that is actually an idiomatic expression. We see this expression. You know, you go to a Christian bookstore today and you find it on like promise rings and little plaques and I love you cards, you know, saying, "May the Lord be between you and me whenever we're apart." But the idiomatic expression actually means, I'm going to kill you the next time I see you. That's exactly what Laban means. It's a death threat. It's basically the idea that the Lord better keep us apart, or I'm gonna off you. So it's a very, very interesting idiomatic expression. But unless you understand the context of any particular culture, you're not going to understand an idiomatic expression. So, this being the 8th live stream, I decided to use the idiomatic expression behind the eight ball. So, for today's session, again, it's going to be an hour and a half. Super chats are going to have priority, like always. If you have a question, please be that's going to be addressed to me as opposed to other people in the live stream chat. Please put a Q and a colon in front of it so I can identify that it's for me. And we will start taking your questions. So the first question, we have actually two pre-questions, that super chats that were given to us long before the live stream started here. So I have to take screenshots of these and then post them on. So the first one here is from RG Strategy for $10. Thank you very much. How many intact tombs or partial intact royal tombs have been found? I know King Tutankhamun, Susenes I, and I read King Horrors of Dynasty 13 was also partially intact. Also, thank you and God bless you. And God bless you also. Thank you for the super chat. Now, when we talk about royal tombs, it's actually more expansive than just kings. Royal tombs includes nobility, princes, princesses, and, you know, daughters, sons of the kings, uncles, that sort of thing. And actually, as far as royal tombs, not strictly kings, we actually find a fair number of intact royal tombs. The tomb of Thuyu and Yuya, who was the step parents of Amenhotep II. They were that was a tomb that was found in Kings Valley, and that was intact. Now, as far as what I think you mean, which is actually the tombs of kings, they're very rare. And you've pretty much actually listed almost all of them here already. King Tutankhamun of Dynasty 18 is probably the most famous one. There were the three found at Tanis. Susenes I, Amenemope and Shoshank II. Those were the three sort of intact tombs. And then, of course, King Hor of Dynasty 13. Now, King Hor's tomb was actually really tiny. It's only like a single shaft. It had enough room for his Ka statue, his coffin, and his canopic jars. It's a really tiny tomb. And actually, it wasn't actually fully intact. It was partially intact. In fact, almost all of these, except for, say, the 3 Tanite kings that I just mentioned, were partially intact. King Hor's tomb had been robbed, and all the jewelry had been stolen off of his mummy, essentially, and all the gold foil had been ripped off of his coffin. So even his didn't escape tomb robbing. Tomb robbing has been around since at least the first or second dynasties. It's his oldest tomb building itself. As for King Tut, it too had been robbed, partially. Tomb robbers had broken into it and had taken off of a few items. We don't know how many items, but they didn't get away with very many, because it had been robbed just as the tomb had been closed, and at that point King's Valley was still being actively guarded, so they didn't make off with much. And then after that, the whole entrance to Tut's tomb had been covered in, and then a workers' village was built on top of it, and that's what kept that safe. Now, in the case of Tanis, and I'm going to just throw up a couple pictures here. This is the picture of Tanis. Now, Tanis is actually an active archaeological site. There's not a lot of areas where you're allowed to take pictures at Tanis. For example, you really can't take pictures too much to the left or the right of this shot. But to the left of this shot is sort of the Well of Souls, as it's sometimes dubbed. This was the quote famous Well of Souls that was supposedly in the Raiders of the Ark film, Raiders of the Lost Ark film. But there are actually just a couple deep water wells, and I do have some photographs of those, and I might show you some other time those. But behind those wells, there's also an active excavation going on of a granary. But to the right of this photo is where the tombs of the Tanite kings are buried. Susenes I, Shoshank II, Amenemope, Takalat I, Osorkon II, even Osorkon I is buried there. And actually, most of those tombs were already robbed. Now, in the case of the Tanite tombs, and I'm going to throw up another picture here. This is actually a picture of inside the tomb of Susenes I. So this is just over the lintel. This is a relief just over the lintel of the door of Susenes I when I was there. So I did get some good shots there, but you are not allowed to take shots like above the tombs. So you can take photographs inside the tombs if you get permission, and I had permission. So you can't actually go to Tanis and expect to take lots of photos. They are really restrictive on photographs at Tanis. And you're not allowed to take any photos at all above it, because, as I say, it's an active excavation area. But you can sort of see that the whole sort of top of the tombs was actually the floor of the temple that had been there previously. So in the case of Susenes I and Amenemope and Shoshank II, they were more in a recessed areas of the tombs, because these tombs are actually sort of crammed into each other. So there's about 8 or 9 kings actually, and a bunch of princes that were buried at Tanis. But these 3 kings were sort of more at the back. So they kind of got hidden from the tomb robbers. So that's how they escaped it, being found. Even so, some of their stuff was looted as well. But these 3 tombs were probably the most intact that we find in Egypt. But very interesting question. thank you very much for your question and your super chat. The second super chat we have is from Tom Wanchik for $10. Thank you very much for your super chat. How do scholars explain the mass departure from Avaris that you often cite in your work? Assuming most reject the biblical narrative, what do they think happened there? Thanks for your ministry. Well, what they think happened is that the river moved, and it's a half-truth. It did move, but it did move later. But what most scholars will say was that the Pelusiac Nash of the Nile moved north, and that the water supply crept away from the city, and this caused the people during the beginning of Dynasty 19 to abandon Avaris and move elsewhere. So that's the general explanation. Now, some of us don't quite buy that explanation, and the reason why is because the port of Avaris, the port's called Peru Nefer, remained in operation through Dynasty 20. Okay, so it's really difficult to say that the whole city picked up and left because the river silted up, but yet the port is still in operation, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You can't have the port, you can't have the river silt up and the port still be in operation to the extent that causes everyone to move from the city itself. So I don't buy the official explanation, and I think there's more and more scholars also coming to that opinion that the official explanation, the majority explanation of why everyone abandoned Avaris suffices. So I just don't think that explanation makes any sense. So you can have either the whole city abandoned, or you can have an alternate explanation that because of the river, or you can try to account for the fact that the river is still in operation. But it's kind of like having it both ways. I think what happened was that the river did silt up, and it did move northward. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I think that happened later in Dynasty 20. That's when I think it happened, when the city of Pi-Ramses was actually abandoned. And they sort of then took all the stones from Pi-Ramses and moved them to Tanis. So that's what I think happened there. But I think that needing an explanation for the abandonment of Avaris, they picked on something that was the most naturalistic cause without sort of thinking through the consequences of this. So that's what most scholars think today. And that's the reason why I don't buy it. Thank you very much for your super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Yeah, regular super chats now. Our first regular super chat comes from Jonathan Monroe for $5. Thank you very much. What are your thoughts on theistic evolution from people who teach that the Genesis account is poetic instead of historical from an ancient Near Eastern perspective? Okay. I think one of the things about, I mean, you've got several issues in this question. This is a very, very complex question, and I don't want to actually do it injustice. Okay. Now, I have problems with evolution from a scientific and a historical perspective. The fact is that at one point in my life, I've been proud of pretty much every view on origins on the map. I've been a theistic evolutionist. I've been a progressive creationist. I've been a young Earth creationist. I've been a old Earth creationist. And right now, frankly, I'm more agnostic than anything else on this, because I haven't decided yet. But I do have some issues with theistic evolution, and it's not so much the theistic part, it's the evolution part. The evolution that's taught today in schools is very, very different than the evolution I was taught even 20 years ago at university. So knowing this, I'm very, very reticent to try to syncretize a secular scientific theory with the biblical account. So I'm very, very reticent to do that on historical basis, knowing that evolution changes its paradigm practically every 40, 50 years. So knowing that, I'm very, very reticent to do that. And I can easily foresee down the scientific roadmap it's changing 2 or 3 times again. I think epigenetics is radically changing the theory of evolution in ways we can't even imagine at this point. So seeing that, I'm very, very reticent to hook it up to the Bible. Now, as far as poetics, just because something is poetic also doesn't mean it's fiction. Prophecy is poetic. Wisdom literature is poetic. There's a lot of things in the Bible that are true, that are poetic. The Song of Deborah is poetic. It also is an accurate account of history. So it's not just poetic or historical. It can be both at the same time. So that's one thing we have to take away from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, is that poetic and history aren't actually mutually exclusive. So just because the Genesis account is poetic doesn't mean it also doesn't have a historical basis. So again, I want to be careful here, but I think there's some issues with it, with a statement that says that the Genesis account is only poetic. I think that's very problematic. Just like in the same way that I would hitch. I think it's problematic to hitch evolution to the Genesis account because it's ephemeral. So anyway, that's my thoughts on this question so far. My thoughts are still developing on this. I might reveal more in the future, but that's where I stand today. Thank you very much for your super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, next one. We got one here from Brian Peachy for $5. Thank you very much. The net has a note that I think you have that's the New English translation, I believe. That's a note that the sons of Heth that Abraham dealt with. It says that there is no known connection between them and the Hittites. Is that true? Well, I'd have to look at the particular verse. No known connection between them and the Hittites. Now, the Hittites are actually go way back. I mean, easily into the time of Abraham. So, the old Hittite kingdom, I mean, we're not talking about the Neo-Hittite kingdom of Suppiluliuma, Hattusas, or Hattusili II. We're not talking about that empire. Before the Neo-Hittite empire, and sorry, the Hittite New Kingdom, I should say, not the Neo-Hittite. Sorry, the New Kingdom. The Hittites' rule is basically broken up into 4 phases. There's a old kingdom, a middle kingdom, a new kingdom, and the Neo-Hittites. Okay, Suppiluliuma, that's the new kingdom. That's the Hittite New Kingdom. But before that, into the time of Abraham, there was still there was a middle kingdom and a old kingdom of Hittites as well. And these kings actually had managed to conquer all the way to Babylon. So the Hittites actually were around long before, say, before the 13th century BC. The history of the Hittites before them is a little shady, but they were there. So I don't think that footnote in the net is very solidly based in history. Now, we don't have a lot of inscriptions because we don't actually have a lot of writing from that period of time. We've got a few inscriptions from that middle phase of the Hittite kingdoms, but we don't have anything from, say, the old Hittite kingdom. But we know that they were around because the Babylonians record them. So, again, there were easily Hittites around at the time of Abraham. So I wouldn't take that footnote for being worth much. But great super chat. Interesting super chat. Thank you very much for that question. Very much appreciated. Okay. Our next super chat by Mohammed Quran for $5. Thank you very much. Is Jeus from Genesis 36 actually mentioned in the story of Sinaway? Seen people like Steve Rudd make this claim. Yeah, Steve Rudd isn't very competent. I know Steve, unfortunately. He's one of these associates for biblical research guys. He's not really an expert in the field, but okay. Let's just take a look at what Genesis 36 actually says. So I'm going to actually pull up my Bible here. Imagine that. So, Genesis 36. All right, and let's see here. All right, and this comes from verse 18. And these are the sons of Esau, wife of Ohilamed, chief Jehus, chief Jalem, chief Korah. These are the descendants of Esau's wife, Aholim Bama, daughter of Anah. Okay, so that's Genesis 36:18. Now, these are the sons of Esau. Esau being the descendant of Jacob. So we are talking about roughly the 17th century BC. That's the time frame here. The 17th century BC. Now, Sinaway actually dates to the time of, let's see here. Let's see if that actually works with the chronology, because it helps to look at your chronology before you actually make any decisions here. So I'm going to look at the chronology here. Sinaway dates, I believe, to the reign of Senwosret III, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to probably look that up, but... And Senwosret III is 19th to 20th century BC. So it's off by about 200 years. So I think Steve Rudd is wrong here. Quite frankly, it doesn't work with the chronology that we know of Sinaway. It doesn't work with the chronology that basically works with the Bible. Now, I know that Steve Rudd is using American biblical chronology to do his stuff. Unfortunately, American biblical chronology has too many problems to really consider it to be viable. So I think Steve Rudd is wrong here. Sorry. But great question and great super chat. Very interesting question. Thank you very much. Okay. So let's see here what else we got. Okay, that's all for the super chats for the moment. Let's start looking at regular questions here. Now, I did see one that unfortunately dropped off the list and I can't recover here. So I'm not going to address that because I can't show it on the screen. But we'll take the next one here. If you do post a question before the live stream and it's not a super chat, I probably won't take it. So just as a reminder in the future, if you're going to do non-super chat questions, wait for the live stream to go live, because otherwise it's just going to pile up and I won't be able to handle it. So I'll take the... What? I'll tell her. Who is this? I don't see that question. Second comment from the top here. Oh, I see it. Okay. All right. How tall were the pharaohs? How did ancient Egypt... Okay. I don't want to be demonetized. How tall were the pharaohs? They were about 5 to 6 feet. They weren't tall, exceptionally tall people, but because nutrition was really garbage back then. But they could be, five-ish feet. I think King Tut was something like 5'2", something like that. It's hard to say because the body does shrink in length after it's mummified, so it's hard to get an accurate height value. So, but they were normal height, generally pretty typically normal height people, as far as, I mean, on the shorter side, but not exactly, I mean, they weren't tall by any stretch of the imagination. As far as their toiletries, they used indoor, they actually had indoor toilets. They had a counter that had a hole in it with a pot, and they would use the pot and then take the pot and dispose of it outside. That's how they did number 2. Okay. For number 1, they just went outside just like everybody else in the ancient world. And did they have soap? Well, they had a kind of soap, actually. They would mix olive oil and natron, and that would actually form a rudimentary soap. So they did actually have a kind of soap. Now, if you think of it, natron is a mild alkaline. So a mild alkaline plus an oil, a fat, gives you soap. So they did actually have a kind of soap. We're not sure how at what time that developed, but we do have records of it into, say, the Ptolemaic period, when they actually this became a very, very big thing. So they did have a kind of soap. Interesting question. Thank you very much for it. Now, I just saw a super chat here. Actually, 2 super chat. One from Sentinel Apologetics. Thank you very much. Good to see you. My beautiful Daddy Falk is in the house. Daddy? Okay, should Exodus 6:3 be translated as a question, as Heiser argues, did I not reveal them my name, Lord? Ooh. Okay. I got a small bone to pick with Heiser on this one. Now, here is my problem with this. Is that there's a lot of mischief that could come out of this form of exegesis. Now, there's a small truth here. Context can sometimes determine that a declarative statement can be read as a question. But Hebrew also has question markers. Now, in this particular passage, there are no interrogative markers. There's nothing here that immediately marks it out as a question. Even the context here doesn't exactly mark it as a question. No translation has regarded this as a question until this, this past, decade or so, where Heiser and the source he's using argue for this being a question. Now, the problem I have with this particular form of exegesis is you can turn any declarative statement into a question, negating it. And I think that's very deeply problematic. Just like, for example, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You can negate that by turning it into a question. In the beginning, did God create the heavens and the earth? Now you got an atheist Bible. Okay? You can turn any statement in the Bible into a negation by turning it into a question. And how you don't negate it is by adding an extra negation to it. So I think this is really, really deeply problematic. And if we start using this form of exegesis all over the place, there's no end to the sort of mischief this can cause. So I think Heiser's method here is deeply problematic, and I would like, even if he wants to go in this direction, I'd like to see him do it in a different way, just because I don't like where this leads. But thank you very much for that question. It's a very interesting question, and I have to say this: I do like a lot of Heiser's work. I think a lot of Heiser's work is very brilliant. I think his work on the Urim and the Thummim is incredibly interesting, incredibly insightful, and I agree with it. I agree with his idea of the divine council in Job. Okay, I think there's merit to some of what he says. So I do agree with it. But I also think he's sort of the biblical studies equivalent of Hans Gödecke. Now, if you're an Egyptologist, you instantly recognize the name Hans Gödecke. Gödecke was an Egyptologist that was incredibly creative, but not always rigorous. And Gödecke would come up with these fascinating, creative explanations. I should go, oh, wow, that is so interesting. And then you start looking at the details and you go, yeah, it's not really well supported. Or, gee, I don't think that really goes where the evidence leads. And you sort of get to the point where you sort of get with Gödecke, and it's like, well, it's fascinating, but I have to keep it at arm's length because it might not be well supported or might have problematic consequences. I think Heiser is biblical studies' answer to Egyptology's Hans Gödecke. So he's an interesting read. He's got some very good points. He's got some very excellent insights. But sometimes he takes it too far. Sometimes the creativity overrides really good sense. So, but thank you very much for the super chat. It's great to see you on the live stream. Love having you here. Okay, another super chat. Brian Peachy for $2. Thank you very much. Where do you think the Tower of Babel was located? I think it was located probably somewhere in southern Mesopotamia. That's where I think it was located. Now, where exactly? I'm not sure. It was probably a ziggurat. That's probably the best we can probably figure it out. One of the things I think about the text is that is very interesting is that it's often a misinterpreted text. The whole Tower of Babel incident is often very much misinterpreted. Now, it's often read as people building this huge, massive tower to reach into outer space, and that's not what's happening in the Tower of Babel. The whole Tower of Babel story. The whole Tower of Babel story is to make a platform and sort of an ecumenical platform to unite humanity to reach up to God. And that's really what it is. It's a kind of alternative worship, very similar to the high places. You know, God had not prescribed the Tower of Babel. Humanity collectively decided to do the Tower of Babel. So, and it was to prevent being dispersed. It was to make a name for themselves. It was to essentially subvert the plan of God. So I think it's not meant to be a massive architectural feat. It's meant to be more an ecumenical feat. And I'm not saying ecumenicalism is wrong, but that seems to have been sort of the point of the Tower of Babel narrative. So it doesn't have to actually have been a big tower. It could have been any old ziggurat that could have sufficed here. So knowing that most ziggurats were done in Mesopotamia, it would then make sense that it would be located somewhere in Mesopotamia, probably either in Sumer, perhaps in Akkad, or someplace in southern Mesopotamia. So that's my thoughts on that. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. We got a $5 super chat from Michael Beeson. Thank you very much. Good to see you again. What does Yahweh have against Honey Nut Cheerios? That is very funny. I very much appreciate that. Any cultural insights that explain why no honey in cereal offerings? Yes. They were ritually impure. Now, honey itself is not ritually impure, but raw honey can be ritually impure in some cases. One is not always sure it contains the parts of bees. You do find dead bees occasionally in honey. And anything that has dead insects in it is ritually impure. In fact, you're not allowed to actually eat. It's not kosher to eat honeybees. It's not kosher to eat most insects in Levitical law. Exception being locusts. You can eat locusts for some reason. Don't know why. You can eat locusts, but you can't eat bees. And honey can contain the parts of bees, so it is actually not ritually pure. The second thing is that when honey is mixed with a cereal offering, it's usually then a burnt offering at that point as well. So that's probably the only reason that I can think of that honey is not permitted as part of temple offerings. Now, it is considered to be a pure food to eat otherwise. But there does seem to be a difference in, say, ritual purity standards between what a person can eat and what's presented in temple offerings. Like, for example, an oxen that has pulled a load may have at one point pulled a corpse and is ritually impure. So an oxen can't be used, any oxen cannot be used as an offering once it has pulled a load, because there's always that risk that it might have pulled a body and be ritually contaminated. So in that case, that oxen can be or butchered and eaten as normal food, and that's no problem. You cook it, yeah, it's not a problem for Levitical law, but you can't bring it and use it as a temple sacrifice. So there does seem to be this dichotomy between foods that are holy and foods that are clean. And you do find that sort of dichotomy here between what is holy, what is clean, what is unclean, and what is toevot, abomination. And no one can touch abomination. You can touch something that's unclean and then be ritually purified. Then you have what's clean, what's normal, and then you have what's holy, and that can be used in temple rituals. So honey falls into that category of something that's clean, but not holy. So that's why it can't be mixed with grain for, that's why Honey Nut Cheerios will just never suffice as temple offerings. Sorry, Kellogg's. Great question. I love that question. And thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. Captain Ahab for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hello, Dr. Falk. And you even spelt my name right. Wonderful. You must have studied a lot of ancient Egyptian texts and inscriptions. Yeah. Any personal favorites? Wow. There's a lot of really good inscriptions out there. The Annals of Tutmosis III are always a good read. I happen to like that. The wisdom literature is very fun. I do actually very much like the wisdom literature, like Nefertiti, Amenemope, Ipuwer. Those are great texts to read. I always get a kick out of reading those texts. Wenamun is just great for a laugh. Wenamun is just hysterically funny. I think if there's one text I think more people should read, it's Wenamun. Wenamun is crazy funny. Sinaway is interesting. I'll give you that. The Tale of Sinaway is very, very interesting, and I liked reading Sinaway. So there's a sample of some of my favorites. Even some of the tomb robbery papyri were very, very interesting. I got a lot out of reading like British Museum, 100054, which is one of the tomb robbery papyri. So I do have my favorites, and just gave them to you. So thank you very much for your super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay. Super chat from Carlo for $2. Do you see Genesis 1 as a response to Enuma Elish? Yes. It is a response to Enuma Elish, and it's also a response to just about every other creation myth out there. Genesis 1 is definitely polemic against all sorts of creation myths, and it's not just Enuma Elish. It's Enki and the Magic Hoe, it's the Ra myth, it's the canoe myth. It's part of this is the fact that when the Israelites are sons of Jacob and the Canaanites that were living in Avaris left Egypt, they came out with a mixed multitude. And the mixed multitude included Libyans, other Canaanites, Egyptians, Cushites, Nubians, Magi. It's a mixed multitude. Early Israel was really the first multicultural country. It had a huge diversity of people coming out of Egypt. Each one of those particular groups had their own creationists. Each one of those had different ideas of what the creation myth was. So, in many respects, Genesis 1 is that retelling of the creation story in such a way that it is also polemic against all the various myths of the ancient Near East. So it is definitely a polemic against Enuma Elish, but also every other creation myth as well. And in a way, this is an attempt to take that mixed multitude and create a melting pot. So they're creating early Israel is essentially a melting pot of cultures, taking this huge mosaic of cultures and creating out of it one nation, one culture. So it's very, very much a response, but it's also an anti-myth. And what I mean by anti-myth is an alternative myth. And I don't mean myth here in the sense of being fiction. I mean myth as in being a reception history, where history is being explained in a way that makes sense to them. So it's arguing it in a way that it takes what they knew of creation, what had been passed down to them, the sons of Jacob, and customizing it in such a way that it could sort of address every other myth that was, say, opposed to the god that they're now worshiping, the god that led them out of Egypt. So that's what's going on in Genesis 1. It's an interesting question. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Thank you very much. Oh, and great question. JD Freeze for $2. Thank you very much for your super chat. Why did pyramid construction end? It was expensive. That's really the answer. It's a short answer. It's a concise answer, but that is actually the answer because it was very, very expensive. Egypt actually suffered inflation. It had an economy that lasted 3,000 years. At the beginning of the Pyramid Age, during Dynasty 3 and 4, labor was cheap. They could build these big, massive stone pyramids because labor was incredibly cheap. That didn't last very long. The Pyramid of Khufu, the largest of the pyramids in Egypt, nearly bankrupted the economy of Egypt. So that's why all the subsequent pyramids are smaller than that one. It's because economics sort of played in a role. Now, when you look at the pyramids of, say, the Middle Kingdom, they're economizing at that point they're no longer making pyramids out of pure stone. They're making pyramids out of mud brick. The core is mud brick, and the outer casing stones are stone. These pyramids had a tendency to fall apart. There were some pyramids that persisted into Dynasty 13, and they're getting smaller and smaller, made out of cheaper and cheaper materials, until you have the very last pyramid that was built by Akhmosa I. Actually, I believe he built it at Abydos, if I am not mistaken, or he might have also built one at Thebes, I can't remember. But he was the last pyramid builder, and his pyramid was, I believe it was 40 feet by 40 feet, something like that. It's tiny. And that's the last pyramid that Egypt builds. After that, what they do is they put these little tiny pyramids on top of their funerary temples. And I mean tiny as in like 1 foot by 1 foot. And it's interesting because one of the reasons why Kings Valley was started is because it was selected as a site because it had a mountain looking it, that was shaped like a pyramid. And each tomb in the Valley of the Kings actually had a little temple in front of it, in front of the entrance. And on top of that temple, the doorway to that temple was that little tiny pyramidion. So so it was essentially pure economics that brought pyramid construction to an end. It was just plain too expensive to continue to do it. This is why eventually you had, as I said, cheap mud brick pyramids followed by rock cut tombs. And that's the reason. Great question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, $5 super chat from Moises Salazar. I had heard that Genesis 1 admits a second, third, or even fourth reading interpretation and how it correlates to other creation stories. Well, Genesis 1 is very complicated. It's very, very complicated, especially when you start taking it in light of, say, chapters 2 and 3. It gets complicated very, very fast. So but at the same time, too, I'd have to be a little cautious here as to what exactly we mean by third or fourth readings or interpretations. Because, you know, that's going to boil down to what is your exegetical method? What's your hermeneutic? Your method of interpretation. And Genesis has been subjected to all sorts of different interpretations over the millennia. You know, after Oregon in the during the patristic period, the allegorical method became the predominant method of interpretation in Western Christianity, and remained so until around 300 years ago with Dom Augustine Calmet. It was the allegorical method read everything in the Bible as an allegory. Did not read according to what we would call the historical grammatical method. So that may be one of the interpretations you're talking about here. So I do think we have to be just a little cautious here, because just because Genesis 1 can be read in multiple readings, not every reading is going to be valid. So that's all I can pretty much say on that super chat. But it can be read in to address other creation stories, definitely. But usually as a criticism. Like, for example, it will sort of engage the whole Tiamat myth, because the Tiamat myth views creation as the god Marduk struggling against Tiamat, the force of chaos, and you know, Marduk slays Tiamat and splits the dragon in half. Part of it becomes the sea, part of it becomes the land. Well, you can read Genesis as a polemic against that myth. Like, well, there was no battle at all. God just said, let the waters divide, and it was. So there is definitely a addressing of that, the response to those ancient Near Eastern myths. But that's not necessarily a third or fourth reading, but that is just reading it in its ancient Near Eastern context. So, again, it depends what exactly you mean by multiple readings and interpretations. But great super chat. Thank you very much. And let's see, what else do we have here? Okay. One of many. $5 super chat, no question. Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, there's a question underneath it. Awesome. Thank you for my wife here for pointing it out. I'll take that question. Is there a book or an online course you would recommend for learning ancient Egyptian? For a book, I would recommend Mark Collier's book on reading hieroglyphs. It's very good. It's very basic, though. It won't get you to the point where you can be competent at reading it, but it'll give you sort of the foundations. As far as the alphabet, the basic uniliterals, I would recommend. I think I've got a 10 or 12 part series on actually how to write and read basic uniliterals on my YouTube channel. That will help. For more advanced work, I would recommend James Hawke's Middle Egyptian textbook. It's probably a little overpriced because it's like spiral bound. It shouldn't have been spiral bound. It should have been actually properly bound, but they spiral bound it. And it's a good book. It's decent. It's a good, solid textbook. Apart from that, you'll need a reference grammar, and then things start to get really expensive and hard to get. But that's sort of the basics. That just getting Mark Collier's book. It's Collier and Manley who wrote it, and it's a good basic start. By the way, Collier was my PhD supervisor at the University of Liverpool, so I know him well. So thank you very much for the question and the super chat. What Tahash animal was used as the tent coverings? Are you talking here about the porpoise skins? Now, we're not really sure what that was. I think you're talking about the porpoise skins here, if I am not mistaken. I'd have to look at what you mean by Tahash animals. But if you're talking about the porpoise skins, there are actually several types of skins that are used in the tent. You had sheepskin, you had ram skin, you had what's sometimes called porpoise skins. Now, the whole porpoise skin thing is debated. Now, could it have been porpoise skin? Maybe. That's definitely a possibility. Avaris was a port city. It did have access to the Mediterranean, and we do know that ancient people did hunt porpoise. So it's entirely possible it could have been an aquatic animal of some kind. It's also possible that it could have been some sort of terrestrial animal. Not exactly sure. That's something I'd have to do really more research on to give you a definitive answer on. One of the things I really didn't touch on in my book on the Ark of the Covenant was the actual fabrics and skins that were used in the tabernacle. And part of the reason I didn't touch on that was because it was itself especially all on its own. There are ancient Near Eastern specialists that just specialize in textiles, and for me to give an authoritative a statement on that would have been a little bit out of my wheelhouse. So it's something I do need to do more work on, and I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but it's something that's worth exploring. But thank you very much for the super chat and the question. It's a great question, though. Okay, that's it for the super chats at the moment. So let's go back to the non-super chat questions here. Let's see here. Let's see if I see a second question by Hate Love Nothing. But I want to give other people a chance for questions too. Although you have a lot of questions. Mm, all right. Zazuze. Interesting name. Question: any resources on ancient Egypt from an economic perspective? Yes, absolutely. The economics of Egypt have been very, very well studied. It's actually one of the hot sort of topics in Egyptology over the last 20, 30 years. Very, very fascinating. Jack J. Johnson. I think it's it's A or double A, I can't remember. SSEN or AN. Can't remember how to spell anything exactly. He wrote a book on the economics of ancient Egypt called, I believe, The Commodities or something of Ramesside Egypt. It's a fascinating book. It's an incredible book. I would highly recommend that. Jack J. Johnson, a very, very, very good book on the economics of ancient Egypt. Highly recommended. He goes into the whole thing, the currency, inflation, what things were worth. That was it. Commodity Prices of Ramesside Egypt. That was the name of the book. Fascinating book. Really great resource. It's really the starting point for any sort of resource on the economics of ancient Egypt. Great question. Thank you very much for asking it. Okay, and I just saw some more super chats here. Super chat there. By Tyler Smith. Thanks for your efforts and rigor. You're welcome. Are there any particular cultural references in the period of the patriarchs or judges that are lost on us that you are aware of? Would confirm the historicity, mythic status that you are aware of? Yes, there is. Abraham's Anakim. His 318 trained men. This is a very, very interesting reference, especially when you look at it and say the cultural context, the contemporary cultural context of Egypt. When you look at, say, the whole question is, I mean, there's two questions that come out of that passage that are just fascinating. The first question is, well, would 318 men really make a difference? The second question is, were they really trained? Now, I actually wrote a paper on this for the Evangelical Theological Society back in, like, I think 2018 or 2017. I can't remember that. But when you look at, say, the 318, all you have to do is to go to, say, the Amarna letters, and you can see a very small number of men can make a huge difference. You know, the city-states, the kings of the city-states of the Levant were making requests in the 14th century for 250 men to even, well, I should say as high as 250 men. But they were also asking for smaller numbers like 20s and 50s to come help them out to wage war. So we can tell that, yeah, 350 men would really shift the balance of power. But the other interesting thing is that whole training aspect. Because one of the things we find in, say, at Beni Hassan is in the tombs of the nomarchs, you see on the wall these wrestling moves. And they're called wrestling scenes. But they're really not quite wrestling. It's more like a martial arts catalog. Each wrestling move on that, and there can be up to like 200-300 moves cataloged on a wall. And each of those moves is unique. In martial arts, you have sometimes what's called a mokuroku, which is a catalog of moves. It's a catalog that sort of defines the martial art. what you have on these walls in these tombs at Beni Hassan is essentially a catalog of a really ancient martial art. And these guys are doing moves that would be recognizable by any martial artist today. You know, things like hip throws, you know, leg sweeps, just it was essentially a martial arts training. And this is contemporary with the time of Abraham. So absolutely, there is definitely cultural references in, say, Genesis that we find in other parts of the ancient Near East that confirm the historicity. And that's just one of them. So, but it's a great question, and that's the one that comes to my top of my head. Thank you very much for the super chat, that $20 super chat. Very generous. I do appreciate that. And great question. Okay. Sentinel Apologetics. $5 Australian. Thank you very much. I laugh because I see the I foreknew the question. Do predestination debates on Romans 9 about Pharaoh conveniently ignore the Egyptological context of the verbs hezek, heshek, and kabad about hardening? I don't think so. It is a particular reading of it, but I don't think it conveniently ignores it. I think there's a wide diversity to these verbs, and I think one of the problems I have with the way, say, Hebrew exegesis is sometimes done is what Grant Osborne and Donald Carson have called the one meaning fallacy, where there's just one meaning to a word, and you always stick to that one meaning whenever you do a translation. These words have semantic ranges. Donald Carson's famous example of the roller coaster. He's telling his students that in class that words can have more than one meaning. And of course he gets some wag in the audience. He goes, "Okay, tell me what's more than one meaning to the word roller coaster." Of course he's stumped, but he thinks about it, and he goes, "Yeah, there is a second meaning. Life is like a roller coaster." He's using the metaphorical meaning to say that there's a second meaning. Well, words in Hebrew can do the same thing. They can have more than one meaning, multiple meanings. They can have literal meanings, metaphorical meanings, analogical meanings, allegorical meanings. Like, for example, the verb to be in Greek has 5 different meanings. So I don't think he's conveniently ignoring the Egyptological context in Romans 9, but I think he is taking a particular reading of that. And I don't think that reading is necessarily wrong. It could be part of the semantic range. So it's an interesting question, but I think there's more going on there than just sort of what meets the eye. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Okay, King in the North. Thank you very much. Good to see you again. Big Daddy Fogel. That's going to stick, I think. Next, it'll be the Popcorn King. Why do you think scholars are quick to accept the Sea People's Philistines' conquest and settlement in canon, but not the Hebrew account? Is there more evidence for the Philistines? No, there isn't. We do have more for the Philistines. We do have slightly more for the Philistines, in all honesty, because they do actually enter the texts relatively a little bit earlier than the Israelites. We do find a brief mention of the Philistines in the Amarna letters when they're just sort of starting to their incursions. Uh, there's also a reference to the Sherohen, which is one of the tribes of Philistines during the reign of Ramses II. And then we find Merneptah actually talk about several of the Philistine tribes, the Dodan, the Luca, and the Paliset. So there's sorry, the Sherohen. There is actually several more references to the Philistines, but that also makes sense too, because when the Egyptians sort of went into Palestine, they typically didn't go in through the Judean foothills. They typically went across the road of Horus and right into, say, the coastal plain. Now we sort of have to understand too the geography of ancient Israel at the time. The geography of ancient Israel isn't the same as it is today. It was essentially two countries. Canaan was essentially two countries divided north to south, east to west, by a swamp that ran north to south through the middle of the country. Okay? So you have a coastal plain where the Philistine cities are. Then you had a swamp. Then you had a valley, the Shephelah Valley. And then you have the Judean foothills, okay? Now, the Philistines are coming in from the north, from Anatolia, and they're sort of occupying the coastal plain. And that coastal plain, if you follow that coastal plain down, goes into Gaza, Ashkelon and Gaza, and you can take the road then, the road of Horus, right into Egypt. And that's what the Philistines are doing when they are invading during the Sea People's invasion of Ramses III, is they're combining a sea invasion with a land invasion at the same time. So we hear more about the Philistines in say Egyptian sources because there's more interaction with the Egyptians at the time, because that's the road that the Egyptians typically take. But the same sort of situation that allows the Philistines to have a foothold during the reign of Ramses II is also going to allow the Israelites to put in their claim in the Judean foothills during the time of the end of Ramses II's reign and the beginning of Merneptah's reign. So it's the same circumstances. Scholars are just sort of blind to the one and not the other. There's a bias there, and all you can do is at that point out the bias. Say, okay, you accept the Philistines did it. Why can't the Israelites also have done it? A bias is a bias. They also have, say, a theoretical underpinning here with the documentary hypothesis and biblical minimalism that sort of confirms that bias. So it's an uphill battle to sort of point this out, but more and more scholars are now actually, coming to terms with this and saying, okay, wait, maybe there's a bias going on here. Maybe it works the other way too. So I am very hopeful that more and more scholars are sort of engaging the data finally. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very generous, appreciate it, and great question. Okay. Moises Salazar for $5. Thank you for the super chat. How do you think about No Story and the geological evidence? Iratru, where the god lives. No Erat. Okay. Iratu and Erat are linguistically related. Okay. And Iratu are the people group in, say, the Caucasus Mountains. Up in northern Iraq. Okay, so I don't have a lot of opinion right now on the Noah story. I'm still sort of figuring that out for myself. And at this point, I'm not going to say too much about the Noah story or the geological evidence. I do have some issues with some of the geological evidence. I have some issues with sort of the idea of, say, a local flood. I think there's some definite problems with that textually, and I think there's some problems with that, say, even geologically. So I've got some issues there, but I'm going to reserve those until I've sort of better read on the issue and sorted out my thoughts on this. But it's a great question, and I'm just not prepared to answer it quite fully at this point. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Apologetics, $5. I'm not being awkward, but here's a better official title you can use. Daddy Falk, Popcorn God, Emperor, Rabbi, High School Girl Crush. What? Popcorn God Emperor, maybe. The popcorn must flow. I'm a big Dune fan, by the way. I love pretty much every production of Dune that's ever been made. I've read all the books. Very, very big Dune fan. The High School Girl Crush, well, I like anime, but even I don't go for that. But the Dune thing, oh yeah, I'm totally buying into that. Thank you very much for the super chat and the good laugh. That's that's funny. Okay, Michael Beeson for $5. Thank you very much. Great Popcorn King. What can you tell us about the Stela, Ankh, F, and Kansu? About how often do Egyptologists get pestered about it? Not very often, actually. I'm actually not even familiar with that Stela. I haven't, to be honest, I haven't even heard of that Stela. Ankh and Kansu. By any chance, is this one of those stelae that is being used to try to prove that Joseph was a vizier in the Middle Kingdom? I'm just asking the question because I don't know exactly the context here. We do get various stelae that come up from time to time from, say, sort of fringe theorists that try to make certain claims. And you kind of have to almost keep a scorecard because there's so many of them out there. So without knowing, say, the greater context of this, it's sort of difficult to say what exactly is being asked here. I will look, if you can elaborate a little more, I might be able to comment a little more. So I will look in the comments here for any, just a regular comment. You don't have to do another super chat, because I do appreciate what you've done here. So if you just put in a regular comment elaborating just a little more, maybe I can touch on this. So, but thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. 501 Mobius, good to see you again for $5. Thank you very much. When and why was Moses not allowed to enter the Promised Land? At the army's refusal to attack the Canaanites in the second year, or the splitting of the rock? From the text, it seems to be the splitting of the rock. Basically, one of the things about being a prophet is you have to communicate the message of God faithfully as it's delivered. If you add your own sort of voice or flourish or add to the word of God, that's a sin. And that's almost disqualification to the office of being a prophet. While the army's refusal to attack the Canaanites in the second year disqualified the people from entering, it did not disqualify Moses. What disqualified Moses was the extra anger he added to God's message when he split the rock. He relayed God's message in a way that showed Moses' anger, not God's anger. So in a sense, he perverted the message of God. He put his own spin on it. And that's what really disqualified him from being able to enter the promised land. The fact is that Moses had one heck of a temper. He had one heck of a temper. And he would use that temper at times in ways that were not legitimate. So that's the reason why he was not allowed to enter the land. But he did follow the people right up to the point where they were about to enter the land, but he himself was not allowed to enter. But it's a great question. Thank you very much for the super chat. And it's good to see you again. All right. Okay, Michael Beeson. Okay, no. So I'm going to take that up. All right. Dynasty 25 to 26. Crowley uses this to found his religion of Thelema. Okay, that's why I'm not familiar with it, because I'm not really familiar with Crowley or his religion of Thelema. So that's why I will have to look into this a little more, because it's not something. This is why I'm not familiar with it, because I have studied a lot of strange cults. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. If you go to my academia.edu page, you'll see a paper that I did researching vampire cults. So I do have a very, very strong sort of guilty pleasure of researching strange belief systems, strange cults, new religious movements. But I think what you're referring to is I believe Aleister Crowley, but I'm not sure. But I sort of have to look this one up. I really would have to look this one up and do some more research. But you've got my interest. And he further adds, I run in occult circles, so I likely have much more exposure with Crowley than the average person. Okay, now I think I know where you're going with this. Now, I'd have to look up that stela to actually read it. And I would probably end up doing a translation and figuring out what it said for myself. But that's not something I can do on the fly here on a live stream. So, but now you've got my interest. Now you've got my interest peaked. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to look this up because you've hit upon a guilty pleasure of mine. So I will look this up, and I will probably have something to say in the near future if it's asked again. So, but you've definitely got my interest. Thank you very much for that super chat, and thank you for expounding on that. That adds a lot more context, and it helps me. So very much appreciate that. Thank you very much. Okay, and we got a $10 super chat from JD Freeze. Thank you very much. Egyptian reliefs seem to mix history with strict artistic rules, as well as religious context and symbolism. Yes, indeed. Almost all the texts we have from ancient Egypt are religious texts. We don't have almost any pure historical texts from Egypt. They're almost all religious texts. Is this an example of the ancient Near East relating history through the prism of mythology? It is, but it's more complicated than that. Part of it's going to be reception history. How do people relate what's happened to them with what they believe about divinity, about religion, about metaphysics, about all that stuff? Reception history takes historical events and tries to find meaning through what people believe. Okay? And we all do this. Every culture does reception history. Okay? Whether it's an ancient Israelite, whether it's an ancient Egyptian, whether it's a modern 20th century historian. We're all doing history through what we believe, what we understand, what we think, and we all try to make sense of it. So this is what the Egyptians are doing. But they're also, most of the texts that they have that survive, we get on, say, temple walls, stelae, few papyri, and almost all of those have a religious context. They are meant to be offerings for gods. The deeds that they did that increase their status in the afterlife. You know, all of that is going to play into how they do their writing, how they relate history, because they're not really relating history for the sake of relating history. That's not their concern. They don't care about history. They don't care about that people 10 centuries later can figure out how they lived. No. That's not their concern in the slightest. Their concern is how does what they do today going to affect their afterlife? Because one of the things about Egyptians is they're living according to apocalyptic time. Life is short in Egypt. Death is imminent. Death is coming, and it's coming quick. You see this, something like this also happened during plague times in Europe, where life is so short that people are more focused on the next life than they are on this life. Because this life there isn't much to it. It's short, it's brief, and you're going to be out of it in pretty quick order. So you're going to get a lot more of religious views, religious reflection, focus on divinity in times where you have apocalyptic time. And Egyptians definitely were living in a state of apocalyptic time. So when they're relating what happened to them, it's always going to be through that lens of religion and reception history. It's a very interesting question, and one can actually talk about this for a very, very long time. You know, people have done books on this subject. It's a fascinating subject, and we're almost sort of just getting the tip of the iceberg here when we talk about this, because it's just, as I said, it's just, there's a lot to it. But thank you for the question, and thank you for the super chat. Okay. Life Avant super chat for $5. Thank you very much. Would you make a video on, and do you have recommendations on the Theban Triad? Oh, it's a good suggestion. Yes. Very interesting suggestion. I hope you're doing well, and I love your work. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I had thought about doing various videos on the various gods and goddesses of Egypt. And there's actually a lot there that can be done. Right now, I have, for the last several months, we've been working on the evidence for the Exodus. You know, I think we're getting ready to release, I think on Monday, video 8 of that series. You know, everyone sort of thinks that, hey, there's no evidence that for the Exodus. Yeah, no evidence. 8 videos later, I'm still not done with material. But I would like to get more Egyptological material back on the channel. So that's definitely a worthwhile suggestion, and I will add it to the ideas file. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Okay, we are getting to the end of the hour and a half here. I will take a couple more regular questions if no more super chats come in. So let me see if I can find one here. Okay. I don't see many Qs. There's a Q. Okay, I'm not going to answer that one yet, because that's an interesting question all on its own. That actually would take more time than I actually have here. So let's see if we can find. Yeah, we have both big questions and little questions. Oh, I think a super chat just came in. Sentinel Apologetics, $5 super chat. Films like the Jurassic Park cause some to wish dinosaurs return. A valid science question? No, it's not. It's not a valid science question. It's an engineering question. The one thing about restoring dinosaurs from Jurassic Park is they're not in any way a natural being at that point. They're actually a human-created being at that point that's adapting to a whole world that they never knew. It's not a science question at all. It's an engineering question. Can you rebuild a dinosaur? So would ancient Egyptian life be applicable in our context? Wow. That's difficult. The contexts are very different. The contexts are extremely different between, say, ancient Egypt and, say, 21st century men. A lot of water has gone under the bridge. You know, whole art movements have come and gone. You know, empires have risen and fallen. You know, it's just so much different. I mean, for the typical Egyptian, it was pure agrarian society where it flooded every year and you had to go to high ground. And you had to live off of essentially what you farmed and weren't taxed. Yeah, taxation's the same. You know, that hasn't changed in 5,000 years. Okay. But a lot of life is very different. You know, your typical Egyptian farmer lived in a thatch house, you know, when they were farming. You do still see these thatch homes in Egypt today. So in that respect, they're still around. They're still around. And much of the way that Egyptian farmers do things hasn't changed that much since 5,000 years ago. But a lot has. You know, cell phones have radically changed modern Egypt. You know, I mean, just let's say just 7 years ago. 7 years ago, the only place you could get a SIM card for a cell phone was at the airport. That's the only place you could get a SIM card. Today, you can go down almost any block in Cairo, in Luxor, in Aswan, and you can find a cell phone shop. We'll sell you a SIM card for an unlocked phone, and then sell you the phone too for peanuts if you want. But that's how quickly Egyptian society is changing. And one of the things that we even don't even consider is life in ancient Egypt was very static. It didn't change much. It went thousands of years without appreciable change. Now, there were things that changed. You know, kingdoms came, kingdoms go, pharaohs lived, pharaohs went. There were political and religious movements in Egypt that did come and go. But that didn't affect for most of the people. Most of the people were farmers. They lived an agrarian lifestyle that was pretty much unchanged for thousands of years. One of the things that's really sort of different about today is the rapid pace of change. Even English just changes at just an incredibly rapid rate compared to, say, ancient Egyptian. The ancient Egyptian language was relatively slow in changing. You know, if you talk to, say, the translation committee of the New International Version of the Bible, they'll be like the first people who tell you that that they have to revise the NIV every like 5 years because the English language is changing so fast. So it's really hard to say what's applicable from Egypt, a society that's almost completely static, to our modern context, because our modern context is a context of change. It's a science context. It's an engineering context. It's an accounting context. It's a information context. You know, we're an information society. We're a society that, you know, gets electricity just by plugging something into a wall. You know, we talk to the world. You know, this broadcast right now, this live stream is going to probably 20 countries, you know, or at least it will end up going to 20 countries. It's instantaneous communication. You know, in ancient Egypt, you wanted to send a letter to somebody, 3 months later, it might arrive. That's if the messenger didn't get killed on the road. You know, that happened too, where you know, correspondence, you know, the letter carrier never arrived because the guy got killed by a robber. So that happened also. So it's very, very different. So it's a fascinating question, and it's sort of a hypothetical question, but we do find, though, that there's some things that don't change. You know, and that's probably even more interesting. Like, for example, in the tomb robbery papyri, you know, there was a fascinating study done by one of my fellow students at the University of Liverpool, and unfortunately I wish she had completed her dissertation because it was a fascinating concept, which was lying in ancient Egypt. And, you know, Egyptians lied pretty much the same way. I mean, if you watch, say, an episode of Cops today, they're using the same lies on that TV episode that Egyptians were using, you know, thousands of years ago. Oh, I wasn't participating in crime. I was just going along to keep my brother out of trouble. Oh, it wasn't my stuff. I was just holding it from my cousin. Do I have a receipt for it? No. Of course it's not. I don't have its stuff anymore. It's now. I never had it at all. What? It's the same lies, and in that respect, Egyptian culture still has something to tell us because they're using the same lies back then as we use today. Society has changed, but human nature hasn't changed. Human nature is exactly the same 5,000 years ago as it was today, or as it is today. So, in that respect, ancient Egyptian life still has something to teach us, because it shows us, say, the consistency of human nature over time. But great question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Michael Beeson, $5 super chat, and we're running into overtime now. Okay, so we're gonna have to make this the last one. What does the Egyptian language tell us about the development of the ghoul on P3X888? Almost nothing. I do like the Stargate movies, but they're not real. Egyptian language has no Stargate. I did get a little laugh recently because I watched the first Stargate movie recently, where the hero sort of, you know, on the chalkboard they have that inscription of the Stargate. And, you know, he rails on the other guy for trying to decipher it using Budge. Now that's sort of a trope in Egyptology, is that the work that Budge did was terrible. It wasn't very good. He was self-taught, and he just isn't very good at doing hieroglyphs. But his volumes were cheap; they were out of print, and a lot of people used them. So it's a trope. But then again, I look at the Heroes translation, and it's not any better. It's also a bad translation. So so one is not exactly better than the other here. But it's a funny question. I like it because I do actually like Stargate. I love the whole sort of the mythos of the science fiction mythos of it. But it's a great question. Now we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you very much for all the questions on today's live stream. I want to also encourage you that if you enjoyed these sessions, consider becoming I want to make you all aware that in October, I'm going to be, if we can get enough people to join, we're going to be doing a tour of Egypt with Tutku Tours. And I'm wearing their t-shirt right now. I happen to be. So I will. Ugh. There we go. Tutku Educational Travel. And what we're doing is we're doing a tour of Egypt. And we're going to be connecting all these ancient Egyptian sites with what we know in the Bible. It's one of those very, very interesting tours. It's well run. I was on their tour in January. But this one's happening in October. And I would encourage you, this is really a great once-in-a-lifetime experience. And Tutku runs a really great tour operation. So if you've got the financial ability and want to see Egypt firsthand and see it from a biblical perspective, I would highly encourage you to join up. The link to Tutker Tours should be in the description of this live stream. So with that, we're going to call it a night. Thank you for everyone who's joined us today. Thank you to all my subscribers. Thank you for everyone who offered a question. Whether or not we got to it, I saw there's some great discussion going on in the live chat. I'm looking forward to reading it after. And I want to thank all the super chats and everyone who has supported this channel through Patreon or who has bought my book. Anyway, have a good night, and I will see you next week on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.